Okay, Year 12, the purpose of this video is to allow you to stop and write notes, replay as you want. It will help you build a deeper understanding of the mechanics of the story. Annotation is an important skill, and it will help you collect evidence that you will need when you are going to write the essay. Now let's look at the rubric. It's incredibly important that when we're preparing this module for the HSE that we continually go back and we look at the rubric. So how are techniques used in text to create different unique images, so either visually or in our imaginations, to tell us something about people, events, attitudes, or the world? And the question, how are techniques, this is what we're doing today. So let's look at the opening paragraph of the story, The Drover's Wife. It's quite atmospheric and really establishes the setting in the Australian bush. Lawson chooses to focus on hardships, and this is shown through the very negative connotations at the very beginning. There is repetition of no and nothing, and we have quite a depressing image of the surrounding environment that is isolated. There is a focus here on absence, so that repetition of no and nothing creates that effect. Then you have that symbolism in the where it says the stunted, rotten native apple trees. This is symbolic of the difficulty in just simply surviving the environment. Lawson wants us to have this idea of how it really was to live even as part of the nature in these Australian bush settings. We then have the metaphor she oaks, which is sighing above the narrow, almost waterless creek, shows us that the environment is also starting to eke out or only just survive here. So we know trees need water to survive, for example. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So here we have the entry of the snake and the family's reaction. There is an authoritative tone established right away. Lawson is quite blunt, usually very direct, and what I like to call very matter of fact. This is, I guess, his signature and his style of writing. We have the adjective, ragged, dried up looking children. It shows that the children are actually starting to take on the characteristics of the environment. Later on we start to see some other adjectives. So the drover's wife here is described as gaunt, sun-browned bushwoman, demonstrating how her difficult life and her poverty has affected her, and that idea of her living a harsh life on the land itself. Okay, but the pace changes here when we see those active verbs. They are shown in red, and they show the drover's wife is quite quick thinking here. She has children in her presence. She has children in the presence of a snake, and there is a very real sense of danger here. And this is presented through those use of active verbs. So some time has passed and there is an anxious wait for the snake to reappear. So the sentence fragment right at the start here, near midnight, reflects this very slow passing of time. So right at the start, we have this nervous wait as the drover's wife watches for the snake. So every now and then, she reaches for the stick, the thunderstorm comes on, and the wind rushing through the cracks in the slab wall. So here we have that juxtaposition. So you've got that courage of the drover's wife who is willing to take on the snake on her own, being placed side by side with the unmatched power of the storm raging outside of their shack. So that's an example here of juxtaposition. Later in the paragraph, we have a simile being used. At every flash of lightning, the cracks between the slabs gleam like polished silver. This is showing that the house is in quite poor condition, but emphasising the fact that the lightning is ever present and always outside. The final line here provides a violent sensory image. So, the thunder rolls and the rain comes down in torrents. Here it suggests there is a storm growing, and Lawson really uses this technique of foreshadowing here to emphasise the growing sense of danger as the night continues. Okay, here we start to have the first of several flashbacks, or some might call a flashback an analepsis. That's the more sophisticated term. But here it's where the drover's wife starts to recall the birth of her children and finally the tragic loss of one of the children. So initially we have some Australian humour. So the Australian slang for an Aboriginal woman was gin. And the idea of the Black Mary becomes an ironic nickname because she is an Aboriginal that is fair-skinned in colour. So this provides an example of Australian humour, that idea of laconic or blunt humour. So you will then notice the dialogue of the Indigenous man that is mentioned here, King Jimmy, mirrors that of his own vernacular. So one of Lawson's characteristics of his writing is to mirror what the vernacular was like at the time he wrote this. So at that time, Indigenous Australians spoke in this manner. So it creates a sense of authenticity, and we get a really effective image of that character. So at this point, the drover's wife is quite nostalgic, or she is remembering the past with fondness or happiness. She's remembering a happy moment, even though it may not seem that way, that at this point, but she's nostalgic. Okay, so the tone changes very quickly at the end here though. So we have one of the children died while she was here alone. She rode 19 miles for assistance carrying the dead child. So there is a tonal shift here. It's quite confronting. It's told with very little detail and it's not embellished. The reason for this is we genuinely don't like to linger on unpleasant details, and the drover's wife is no different. She doesn't want to keep thinking about the grief and how horrific it would have been for her. The word brevity simply means briefness. It's just some meta language for you to use, perhaps in an essay response. Okay, so again we also see another flashback. The alliteration here. She stood for hours in the drenching downpour. It shows the drover's wife's determination and also her endurance as well, because she is trying to save a dam, and she really does understand how much work her husband had put into the dam, so we get that sense of empathy as well. Then you've got where it says, there are things that a bushwoman can't do. This line here reflects the attitude from the time when Lawson was writing and when Lawson was living in. Okay, so we know already that the drover's wife is quite self-sufficient. She's had to live a lot of her life on her own with children living on the land, and she's had to survive, and she's had to help her children survive. But at this time, in the story, Lawson is suggesting that a bushman may have been able to save the dam rather than the drover's wife. But of course we know better now, but Lawson is reflecting the context of the time in which he wrote. Okay, so where it says, next morning the dam was broken and her heart was nearly broken too. So here we have a metaphor, okay, so demonstrating the drover's wife's selflessness, or the fact that she does feel that empathy for her husband, and she feels quite strongly for his hard work and that it's going to be destroyed. And then you've got that final sentence fragment showing that empathy, but perhaps more important, something we rarely see in the character of the drover's wife, which is that sense of caring and loving, typically feminine qualities, but some would argue that because she is forced by the circumstances to take on both parenting roles, her character is made to seem quite masculine in most of the story, and her behaviour in most of the story is quite masculine, but here we get that glimpse of those feminine characteristics and that emotional side as well. So that's providing another layer to the character of the drover's wife.